Welcome back to another Diving Deep podcast by Project Nerd, the place where we get serious on big topics. Diving Deep is not your normal Project Nerd podcast, guys. We have great and entertaining series that cover everything geek and pop culture, even a brand new sports podcast and sports ball. So we sit here and take pride in being an escape, in being entertainment, and being what we would like to consider as funny. So why do we continue to put out serious podcasts on this very feed that houses the entertaining Nerdcast, I'm Not Famous, and Podcast Unreal? Serious things like these diving deep topics I will get into today and we have in the past. The answer really is simple. We have a responsibility. Right now, we have a president who is working on dividing the country more than it has been divided in a long, long time. During the first presidential debate this week, he refused to condemn white supremacist and violent conservative militia groups. He attacked the basic rules of our democracy as usual, and he refused to tell his voters to be peaceful about the election, once again claiming that if he loses, it will be because it's rigged. This, with so many of the other actions Trump does on a regular basis, has to be stopped. We as people have no lanes when it comes to injustices, when it comes to lies from authorities, when it comes to crookedness and deceit. The argument of stay in your lane is irrelevant, whether you're an actor, an athlete, a creator, an influence, just a human being. The lane we all belong in is that lane of humanity. And that's a lane that's in trouble right now for many reasons, including the reasons I just mentioned, and also the reasons that is the topic of this very episode. So in between the enjoyment of Podcast Unreal and our spotty releases of the Nerdcast, I assure you more are coming soon, and ahead of our return of podcasts like Movie Night with Project Nerd and I'm Not Famous, all that air right here on this very podcast feed, Diving Deep will live and it will serve to educate. We all have a responsibility, not just me, not just the other Project Nerd staff members, but every one of us that live and breathe. We all have a role to play. Our role here at Project Nerd is to impact people in a positive way. Most of the time, that's through entertainment. But when the world and this country are operating with people in authority hurting others because of their race, their belief, or who they love, we focus on the lane of humanity, not entertainment. And we will do so until the world shows love will trump hate. Now to our regularly planned topic. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Project Nerd as a whole.
I could let them know about the sorrow and the happiness that the future has in store for them. Maybe they could learn from it.
Let's dive deep.
Let's dive right in.
We're gonna dive deep into this.
Let's deep dive into this.
This is Diving Deep.
This is Diving Deep.
This is Diving Deep.
The federal government is huge. Like huge. People all across the country hold federal jobs and perform tasks on a daily basis to keep this country moving. Thousands upon thousands of people, even internationally, are employed. But if you go back to grade school, you'll be reminded that there's 3 branches that drive this country forward. The executive branch, which houses the office of the President of the United States, the legislative branch, which contains the United States Congress divided into the House of Representatives and the Senate, and of course the judicial branch, the branch that boasts an expansive hierarchy of federal courts. This includes the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the federal judiciary system of the United States of America. It holds the power of judicial review, the ability to invalidate a statute for violating a provision of the Constitution, and often serves as a deciding factor on cases when ambassadors, politicians, ministers, and consuls are under question, as well as which a state shall be party. The Supreme Court's importance is really unending. The Chief Justice and Associate Justices within the court have the ability to overturn decisions of Congress or the President when it deems their ruling violates either the Constitution or statutory law, something that's been violated a lot lately. In short, the Supreme Court is the branch that is expected to keep the other 2 in check, really. And although the President, members of the House of Representatives, and senators run for election on a routine basis, typically within the construct of a 2-party system, of course, when it comes to the Supreme Court, justices are appointed as opposed to elected. There is an expectation within this country and the courts that political party affiliation doesn't come into play here. Obviously, during an appointment it will, but in terms of the decisions made by these justices. And especially as the Chief Justice and Associate Justices when the Supreme Court are expected to rule based on law and constitution, it can sometimes go against either party. However, it is politicians with political goals that are responsible for appointing these justices, leading that to not always be the case. For much of history, the Supreme Court has had a notoriously conservative reputation. Supreme Court justices spent decades ruling in favor of outdated and oppressive measures in order to avoid being the cause of major change or revolution. And although the court did more notoriously align with the conservative right by default, it didn't really serve as a political tool. Long-standing, it served as the balancing branch. That was until Franklin D. Roosevelt's 12 years in office. During his historic span as president, the Democrat had a record-setting 8 nominees appointed to the court, including icons Hugo Black and William O. Douglas. The liberal-leaning collection of justices would soon impact major change we still see today. During the next few decades, it was when the radical change finally came to be, really. We saw Brown versus the Board of Education, the removal of religion from public schools, the expansion of free speech, the rights of criminal defendants, and so much more. This really allowed our country to finally get closer to truly being a free country for all. This country was heading in that direction of progress, and it just so happened that the Supreme Court would just be there with it. The justices were appointed, but revolution was already happening, coming out of wars and depression and everything else. Much of it on the heels of the FDR appointments, all that change kind of came full circle. It even led Republican Dwight Eisenhower to appoint 2 judges that ended up even falling more on their liberal side. But after the period of progression came Nixon and Reagan, the 2 presidents responsible for most of the mess we are in the middle of today. During his time as president, Nixon saw 3 justices nominated and appointed. All 3 obviously very conservative. And even though matters such as Roe versus Wade and other progressive acts still passed in that time, it was the start of a conservative change across all 3 branches. In fact, the 3 justices appointed in the Nixon era are 3 of the 14 Supreme Court justices that Republican presidents have appointed since 1969. In comparison, the Democrats have only appointed 4 in that time period. But the Supreme Court carried on, and more time than not, progress for basic human rights for all have really triumphed. We've seen growth, we've seen progress, and we've seen rulings that have given marginalized communities hope and opportunity. Those rulings came to pass because conservative or liberal, all citizens of this country, no matter race, gender, sexual orientation, or even place of birth, should have basic liberties and equal rights. And that is the job of the justices. Although in our lifetime we've seen the Supreme Court do more good than bad, it is now in 2020 that a red flag of concern has been raised. Ruth Bader Ginsberg, often referred to by many as the notorious RBG, has passed away just 42 days ahead of a monumental election, leaving an associate justice seat vacant. Currently, even with the numbers in the 2018 midterm showing progress, the Republican Party still remains in control of the Senate, the operating body that really decides on the president's nominee for the court. And when Trump gets a window of opportunity to leave a long-lasting legacy that will skew this country in favor of the oppressors and rich, you better believe he's going to take it. There were many reasons young progressive people, especially those wanting equal rights for all, were collectively holding their breaths every time Ginsberg went to the hospital or was presumed dead. Trump had already appointed 2 judges. One was due to an election year nominee from Obama being held up by the Senate, and another due to a retirement decision from a conservative justice that wanted to ensure his seat was replaced by a conservative for many decades to come. Ginsberg has long served as the last hope of balance in the Supreme Court, with a 5-4 conservative favor being just down the line to keep basic rights for all possible. 6-3 doesn't look as friendly, especially when you consider who serves on the court. Neil McKill Gorsuch was nominated by Trump and appointed by the Senate less than a month into Trump's presidency. And although Gorsuch was born in the progressive state of Colorado, he is well known for his conservative nature. However, his leanings are much more swayed by the Constitution than his personal belief, thankfully, at least from what we've seen over the past 4 years. Gorsuch shocked many when he was the one to write the details of a Supreme Court ruling just this year that deemed it unconstitutional for businesses to discriminate in employment against LGBTQ people. Let me re-say that. He not only supported the liberal side or the progressive side of this, he was the one to write the details of that Supreme Court ruling. However, Trump's next nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, was on the other side of that ruling. Kavanaugh was nominated and appointed in 2018. Many of us have vivid and fearful memories of that appointment. His appointment came after a circus act from Congress in which the Democrat representatives made somewhat of a mockery of the system. Don't get me wrong, Kavanaugh has been accused of sexual misconduct, with only one of his 4 accusers retracting her claims. Just one. Not to mention, the hearing uncovered Kavanaugh's history of alcohol abuse, his questionable demeanor, and a temper that may not be Supreme Court justice compatible. But it doesn't take away the whole process 2 years ago being pathetic. This puts Ginsberg's health in the driver's seat for the next 2 years. Her life being the single factor holding the court somewhat neutral or swinging it very conservative, and keeping everybody holding their breath from 2018 to 2020. So this is, of course, why her passing just months ahead of election is such a big deal. Trump is being presented with an opportunity to nominate and push through his 3rd Supreme Court justice. Trump's nominee to replace the Honorable RBG is nothing like her successor, Judge Amy Coney Barrett, a federal appellate judge and Notre Dame law professor, stands as a quote-unquote proven conservative choice. Barrett is publicly against LGBT rights, reproductive rights, and fair immigration. She stands against Obamacare and looks to repeal that quickly. She has a history of putting her religious beliefs over the Constitution, and it's widely suggested that she has a huge interest in eventually helping overturn Roe v. Wade. And the fact she's a Christian doesn't discern me at all. I too believe in a higher power, but knowing she is part of a Christian sect called People of Praise, a group that believes women are second-class citizens and has notoriously fell on the wrong side of the equal rights conversation for decades, does very much alarm and discern not only myself, but many others. And of the highest importance is that Barrett is only 48 years old, potentially keeping her seat radically conservative for decades. 48 is young, and that is why Trump is looking at her. But before I get ahead of myself, it's not Barrett herself that is the argument, at least not yet. Trust me, she'll likely get there. The problem right now is the way in which Trump, McConnell, and many Republican senators have played this game. In 2016, an election year in which President Obama was to succeed his 2 terms in office to either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, the Republican-controlled Senate refused to hold hearings or vote on the president's nominee. This, of course, being completely the opposite of what that Republican-controlled Senate is doing here now. President Obama nominated Merrick Garland in 2016 to fill Justice Scalia's seat. At that point, there were 237 days until the presidential election. This time, we're only 33 days away from this year's presidential election. In 2016, Mitch McConnell was already serving as Speaker of the House. McConnell arrogantly put a stop to Obama's nomination, not just for Supreme Court justice, but for countless a federal judge. He refused to even hold a hearing on this nominee. His claim was justified, at least in his case, by stating that no president in an election year should have that decision, a claim that he has obviously completely disregarded in 2020. This time, the same smug Speaker of the House didn't even wait for a day to pass once Ginsberg's death was announced. He spoke publicly on the Friday of her death, stating that he would push through Trump's nominee to the Supreme Court as soon as the nominee was presented. Hypocritical? Without a doubt. Surprising? Nah, not at all. Trump and McConnell have the chance to push this Supreme Court in a more conservative direction for what will possibly be generations to come. For McConnell, it seems that this would thrust upon him a legacy he just can't pass up, no matter the risk for him or the Senate majority. For Trump, well, it's just Trump being Trump, a president who time and time again has proven he cares little about consequences, the needs of others, or what's right. McConnell's arguments of defense are filled with denial that he's flip-flopped since 2016, or this being a decision due to the president being on his side of the aisle. But anybody and everybody can see the truth, even those that support it. know the truth. This is a political move that is politicizing the judicial branch of the federal government and is likely to not only delay progress for rights of minorities, women, and immigrants that entered this country legally, but it is also likely to turn back some of the rights that have previously been granted. Roe v. Wade has long been a topic of these discussions in the Supreme Court, and it definitely will be something discussed if McConnell and Trump get their way here. Barrett, being the sixth conservative judge appointed, if it goes through, is a ruling could possibly be done very quickly to overturn Roe v. Wade. But no matter what we as voters do in November, we really have little power over what happens right here with this Supreme Court justice appointment. Even if Republican voters pulled their heads out of their asses and admitted what was happening is wrong, a stack of emails, calls, and letters to these conservative senators would not change the course at this point. The senators on both sides of the aisles have repeatedly shown us, especially here in 2020, that their party allegiance and re-election holds more importance than the people of this country. Unfortunately, no matter how many geek podcast networks do serious episodes calling out the hypocrisy of McConnell and other senators, the decision is going to be made. Barrett will become the next Supreme Court justice. As we declared in our statement of current social situations on our website recently and in our episodes of Diving Deep that discuss the facts and proof of systematic racism, the strongest impact we can make right now is to vote in the next election and vote in future elections. But we need to drive long-term change in November 2020. Again, 33 days. The goal would be to expand the roster of Supreme Court justices if the Democrats are able to take control of the Senate. Sure, it's a political move in itself, and I'm sitting here condemning McConnell and Republican senators for their political move. And those senators and voters are going to cry foul for sure if the Supreme Court justice is expanded. They'll quickly forget what we're talking about right now and the very decision to appoint somebody a month out from an election by McConnell, Trump, and the Republican-led Senate, the same Republican-led Senate that said it was not right 4 years ago. But an expansion to the Supreme Court wouldn't just serve as an act to bring back some balance, which is very important. 5-4 makes sense. I'm not sitting here calling for 6-3, 7-4 in favor of a liberal. We do have two sides, and unfortunately, this is a two-party system that has created two polarizing viewpoints in this country. And balance in the Supreme Court has done it well. It hasn't always gotten the results I've wanted, but again, it's done it well. But the biggest thing expansion to the Supreme Court could do is really move us forward in better representing this country. Currently, 9 justices make the decisions for a population that is greater than 331 million. That's right, we have over 331 million citizens in this country, and 9 people largely get to decide what is and what isn't constitutional. If we add more justices, we have a better chance of better representing those 331 million people. But expansion is only possible if Democrats take power of the Senate. This would require something that the Democrats have been missing over the past few years. Let me say it again. Voters. Thankfully, Ginsberg's passing has led to a huge uptick in voter registration, the one silver lining of the legend passing. And some nonprofit organizations reported a nearly 60% increase in registration over the weekend of her death. But it will take a Democrat Party swing by both the president and in the Senate in order to cause this change. Will it be enough? I don't know. I leave you with a few thoughts on Ginsberg. The notorious RBG was a beacon of hope and positive change. She fought and fought and fought, never giving up. She served as a professor at multiple prestigious universities, served as a general counsel to the ACLU for 7 years, the very ACLU she helped found. And she obviously served as a Supreme Court justice for 27 years. Ginsberg's votes helped change lives for millions of Americans in a positive way. She gave extra rights, along with others, to the LGBTQ plus community and, of course, women. The liberal icon was quoted as saying, "Women's rights are an essential part of the overall human rights agenda. Trained on the equal dignity and ability to live in freedom all people should enjoy." This is a stance Barrett doesn't even come close to backing, as we've explored by her Christian sect beliefs, as well as her putting, once more, religion over constitution. Honestly, Ruth Bader Ginsburg left behind a powerful legacy, a legacy that not even Barrett or any conservative-leaning high court could tarnish. But the court may not tarnish it, it definitely will ignore it. And one can only hope that we as Americans fight to keep this legacy going. That's it for this episode of Diving Deep. We hope you truly consider voting this November and for all elections to come. Hi folks, once again, as I mentioned at the opening, Diving Deep is taking on some serious topics, and we're littering them right in between many of our fun and entertaining podcasts on this feed. This specific Project Nerd podcast feed is home to 23,000 listeners, and it's important. I know some of you already get this. Some of you disagree with me and want these things that are happening to happen. But there are a handful of you that aren't sure what the right direction is. We encourage you, no matter what your stance is, to vote, to exercise your human right, to move things forward. We can't continue to see 65% voter turnout, and I will cover that in a future episode of Diving Deep. In the meantime, make sure you head on over to projectnerd.com/podcast. Subscribe to as many of the podcasts you want. Again, most of them entertainment, but if you want to hear more important messages and even political topics, continue to listen for future episodes of Diving Deep.